I've spent some time discussing the way that typically a work of mine will be embedded in a larger series or process of working. And I've given some examples of that. But today I want to talk about one of these embedded works, which very much, has the appearance of a collection of poetry. So what it presents itself to be is a book of poetry, which also presents itself to be uh, a book drawn from visions, sort of recovered from the abyss of madness. And I want to say something about the way that particular book called A Labyrinth of Visions is put together, why it's called a labyrinth, why it's called visions, why it's a labyrinth instead of the labyrinth, and why the visions are plural. And although some of that is obvious, I think it's gotten lost in translation, even though it was written in English. But in order to do that, I kind of have to explore a lot of different ideas and pieces of time. But anyone who's been listening to this knows that that's typically how I work and what I do. Anyway, so let's just start with the imagery that I created for the cover of this volume. And you'll see again that it's very much a collage. It's very much plural. There are a lot of repetitions. The repetitions may or may not refer to ideas of eternal return, as especially as they're articulated in Eliade. This idea that our lives are figura of these primal archetypes appealed to me in constructing a book exploring these ideas of subjectivity and madness. So to begin with, the book grew out of an elaborate performance and occupation. I could say like situationist occupation of numerous positionalities within the social field and economy of the mental health industry in the United States. And it related the performance within those positionalities back to a number of different points in literary and social history, including textual engagements with a number of different, psychological traditions and other kinds of traditions as well, beyond merely the literary or the poetic. So including discourses on shamanism, including discourses on possession, including other kinds of discourses as well. So that was the sort of situationist context in which the volume grew out of, and I wanted to record a construct of the kinds of visions that that belong to this semantic field. So here are some inscriptions from the title page. and here's a representation of the first page. Now, I'll begin talking about the way that I constructed the book and what I had in mind for the construction of the book. So it presents itself as a kind of lyric poetry. It presents itself as this I that speaks and records the inner experiences of this localized subjectivity. But in fact, the book, the text itself, is composed almost entirely of selections of words and phrases, and sometimes lists taken from both contemporary poets and poets of the near and distant past. So it's a collage work in the manner advocated by one of my former poetry teachers, David Anton, but it's a collage work that does something odd. It presents itself as a lyric voice, and the reason that I created it that way was because I wanted it to be haunted in the way that the inner speech haunts the schizophrenic. And I wanted it to be ambiguous in that way as well. So I wanted the reader of the poem to move in and out of recognizing these familiar phrases. I mean, isn't it so that we remember these lines from poems and works of literature or songs that we listen to often or read often, or that strike us as powerful? So I wanted the entire poem to be composed of these voices, and I thought of, in a certain sense, Plato's take on the madness of the poet, or the divine madness of these voices, and I in some way wanted to literalize that materially by creating this lyric voice that speaks as an I that's entirely constructed from other voices. And there are a few moments in the poem in which I make that explicit, and so I sing myself through the voices of others, which is, of course, stolen from Walt Whitman. And I liked the way that it was that moment of revealing that I assumed many readers would be familiar with Whitman. I've also used Dickinson throughout the poem, and I assumed that many readers would be familiar with Dickinson as well. So those moments are when Whitman is used or when Dickinson is used. Those are the two poets in particular, but Blake sometimes as well. I assumed that many readers would be familiar with Blake. So when those voices are used, they're usually moments of revealing and of questioning both, the subject's ontology and of becoming aware of, this sort of dream within a dream that these voices describe. And then other voices, the beat poets, Gertrude Stein, obscure Hungarian poetry and lyrics, and other more obscure, harder to find, or more remote, textualities are pressed into the poem in a number of different semantically significant ways, but that I didn't necessarily always expect my readers to be aware of their sources. Now, I should probably say something about that too. So, not documenting these sources is an important part of the psychological effect of moving into the subjectivity of the possessed one, right, or the one inspired by the muse, and of feeling in some way a familiarity, a kind of deja vu, but maybe not being able to entirely pinpoint it. So this was something that also belonged to the idea of the lyric for me, and that felt very different than writing a novel. And the take on the novel that comes out of Bakhtin is the dialogical, right? So that Mikhail Bakhtin, the great Russian literary theorist and historian, argued that the novel is the most dialogical, that is, the most multifold, perspectively and vocally, that is, in its very nature, creates these competing discourses and these heterogeneous modes of speaking of any literary genre, and so in a way it was natural, I suppose, for the use of these kinds of textualities and quotings, like in the way that Kathy Acker used found text, or transformed found text, or Burroughs transformed these junk texts into novels. It fit into this theoretical framework of the dialogical, because these were novels, and there were some individuals who worked this way and who documented all of the material that went into the poem, and then there were individuals who failed to document that. And I always figured that, because it was the case with my work, that documenting versus allowing the reader to figure it out was a strategy. So, for example, Jackson McClough, who is one of my is no longer with us, but was always one of my very favorite poets, probably because he challenged so many assumptions of not only poetry but of mind and subjectivity and reading and interpretation and what we look for meaning in, and et cetera, et cetera. So in any case, he was methodical about documenting, both the process of the making and suggestions for performance. And I always understood that as his underscoring the fact that he was essentially an architect, right, or a designer or an engineer, and that he was not just creating poems, but he was creating poetic forms. And so to document the fact that he was creating poetic forms was essential to the pedagogy of his work, because these forms, once created, could be reused, and it seemed to me that Cage was very much like that too. He documented the way that he created work was often more important than the results itself, and I think results are always more important than the work, but not necessarily the process and organization. So there was the reason for doing it made sense. Now there are also individuals who create within poetry these documented texts that tell you, what the sources are from, that do so to give you, some sense of how the transformations in the piecing together work. And then, there are individuals, more like Kathy Acker, who failed to, or Burroughs, who failed to document precisely because the experience, which is almost hallucinatory if you read certain Burroughs texts or Kathy Acker texts, and getting it or piecing it together is part of the pedagogical process, as opposed to exploring how it got made. So with Acker, who I always took as really more of a feminist than as a collagist, the point was to bring these different types of voices, particularly like this presence of this, patriarchal voice and this topos, or like territory map of patriarchy, and to wonder in it as this radical feminist. And that seemed to me to be only possible if we, were listening along with her in the text. So couldn't really be documented. It would destroy the point. It was documented in certain ways, like at the outset, right? Like when a title of a piece would obviously refer to the Marquis de Sade, or when the title of a piece would, and we were aware that it was there, in the way that we were aware with Joyce's Ulysses that we were wondering with his characters, with Stephen Dedalus and with Bloom, across this lurking in the background landscape, but we didn't need to at every moment receive the documentation of where we were in that journey. So I wanted that. I wanted that hearing, that overhearing, that listening for the voices, that speculation, all to be there. And I don't want to push this too far, but maybe even a little suggestion of a paranoia. Did I just have a deja vu? Have I heard this before? Where are we? I wanted and so, lyrically, it seemed to me that I could accomplish this that was one technique. And then as it progressed, I realized that I could use other techniques as well. So before moving on, that's one of the reasons why, this is plural, this word visions, because it's composed of all of these different elaborate visionary poems and texts of the past, and non-visionary poems and texts of the past, and it creates this labyrinth of reading, for the reader. And I wanted this labyrinth of visions to be a labyrinth of the subject positionality of the reading experience, not the object itself. I was very much not interested in the object, although I wanted the texture of the piece to feel smooth enough that one could believe that it was a lyrical subject position. So I often felt in reading, the work of a poet like Clayton Eshelman, that there was so much to get over in pushing through these references, one piled on top of the other, that in this language that that almost made it impassable and absurd that I wanted to avoid that. And I guess if I had like a stylistic model, it would belong to surrealism, which always, it seemed to me, had like this very fluid, I mean, I guess that was the point. Bring together these rapid fire, incongruous, and bizarre juxtapositions, but do it through this very like generously beautiful grammar. And so the grammar or the repetition or would be like precise, and that would allow like for this belief in this lyric voice. So, you know, that has to do with the plurality as well. Like, how do you bring all of these multiple things together and still house it under a single subjectivity? Well, syntax, you know, and repetition and sound, you know, was one of the ways that I did that. All right, so the other way was, you know, I wanted this subject, the literal schizophrenia literally means, you know, broken hearted, but sometimes it's confused with this idea of a splitting of mind, and you know, depending on who you read, you know, there are all different kinds of definitions, but the idea of having voices already suggests more than one subject position. You know, for one to be hearing a voice inside one's head, one has to be separate from the voice that one is hearing. So one of the questions that intake psychiatrists always ask is, are you hearing voices? And I used to like to answer that question when I was doing other kinds of performativity within this semantic field, with the response, yes, I'm hearing one now. And generally the psychiatrist would ask, what is it saying? And I would say, it's asking me if I'm hearing voices. And the point is that, you know, we always hear the voices of the outside world, unless, you know, we're deaf, and then those voices can be interpreted for us, or we can find ways of interpreting them, and then we do hear them in some way, whether it's, you know, with our ears or with our mind's ear. So we always hear outside voices, but we also always hear our own voice, or we wouldn't really be able to write poems, you know. So the poet is someone who has a strong inner voice, but the poet is someone who, unless that poet is insane or mad, as we used to use the expression, can distinguish, you know, that voice. Well, Plato didn't think so, but can distinguish that voice from the reality outside, and in, you know, in some way inhabits the space of a kind of a dream work, right? Not Freud's dream work necessarily, but the creating of a poetry or any kind of poesis is the inhabitation of a dream work in which, you know, you can sort of defer or put off or put in abeyance the distinction between the created realm that you're composing and the reality in which you exist. And there, you know, psychiatry loves to say that, you know, there's a fine line between madness and creativity, and it's always finding that fine line, whether it exists or not. All right, so this inner voice, we also always have that. So we already have an outside voice and we already have an inside voice. But I guess what the psychiatrist wants to be asking is, are you experiencing hearing an inner voice that clearly doesn't belong to your own subjectivity, some other inside of you, right? So so, you know, that being so, and this was almost a cheap, you know, strategy for this text, because it's so obvious in a way. So the final version of a labyrinth has these two voices, right? It has I did this, and you. But unlike the voices in, or at least the way that most psychiatrists account for, you know, schizophrenic experience, the voices are more or less saying the same thing, and they grew out of the same text, right? So anyone that's familiar with the text that I'm using will know that the split is imposed, meaning that I just arbitrarily decided that I'm going to break the I here and the you here, and one is going to be speaking this part of the story, and the other is going to be speaking that part of the story. So the weight of the relative pronouns here, right, carries the split. And then I did the same thing with tense. I split it between, you know, this subject that's narrating the past. So the lyric narration of the past is almost archaic now, but you know, it belongs to like these long stories, you know, like the rhyme of the ancient mariner, you know, which he tells this tale of the past, and you know, beginning with I don't know really beginning where, but you know, Shakespeare's sonnets are largely set in the present, and romantic poetry, you know, moves, you know, in and out of the past. But I thought of this like narrating subject, this historian of the vision, as being archaic, and then you know, moving into this you, like in the present, like created something different. Then, you know, the other things, some of the other issues that, you know, came up were, well, who else, you know, uses you as opposed to I? Because the you is clearly used as an I, right? And I thought of, you know, Paul Celan, who will often, instead of saying I, say you, and it always had registered as a kind of like relationship to an I thou experience, and or not maybe being able to say I, or imagining looking at himself, you know, from a distance, and giving it a real powerful impact. And so I moved, you know, back and forth across these pronouns, and I moved back and forth across past and present tense. That was another way. So the I and the you was, you know, also emphasizing like this dialogue between, you know, two different subject positions, and hence again, you know, the importance of the plural in the title. And then, well, here's a good moment to switch into something else. So once I had this, you know, this text, constructed of both remembered and sought textualities, right? Because sometimes I would have a vague memory and I would want it to be more precise, so I would, you know, approach that volume and imitate it more clearly. So once I had that as a layout, then I thought of the work on this piece as almost like painting. And so when you paint, you know, you put something down, and then you come back and you put something over that, and then you rework the surface a number of times, and then a pattern starts to emerge. And I mean, there are a lot of different ways of painting, so I shouldn't say that, you know, you do that, but one might do that. And if one, you know, paints in that manner, or in a process, that the first draft isn't really even a draft. It's just the background. So that was the background, and then I would work on the surface, and figure, what do I need. So I really wanted to explore ideas of collective unconscious, because those were precisely the issues at stake, right? So I systematically went through the piece once I had an outline for it, and I added references like adding like little detailed figures. So I added references from different mythologies. So a lot of so here's a little example of what clearly these references come from Egyptian mythology. So the story of Osiris and Isis is well known, right? Osiris is destroyed in combat, and his body is scattered across the universe. And Isis, spends centuries, millennia, traversing the universe and gathering up these pieces of her destroyed husband and sews them back together. So Osiris was in some way a key metaphor for the structure of the piece itself, as was the Sphinx, both from Egyptian mythology and from Greek mythology as well. So I did it as kind of laminae, so that there would be like a process of going through the poem and adding references to Egyptian mythology where I thought that they syntactically fit, and then there would be a process of going through the poem and adding references to Greek mythology where I thought they syntactically and semantically fit. I had to do some more work on British and Celtic mythologies in order to really even have enough knowledge to add that. There was a laminae that involved fairy tales. There were African laminae. There were all different kinds of laminae that ultimately created this surface. Here's a reference to Dante. Okay, and then in my version of the work, not in a version that was published rather poorly and malignantly, but in my version of the work, I still had at that time a lot of representations of artwork that I had done across the years and time, and so I placed a visual image before each one of the individual poems, or they could almost be called like mini chapters, and they all had like the same structure as the title. So the title, A Labyrinth of Visions, and then the difference was then for these I would use the instead of a, but the seven gates of Hades as opposed to a labyrinth of visions, and all right, so, and you'll notice too that in this is a rare example of a title chapter because it's missing the of. So I wanted the metaphor to persist throughout, the labyrinth of visions, the something of this, the something of this. And a lot of the chapter titles were plural as well. They would end in words, not the word. There would always be like this split. So in this poem, like the doubling, like this idea of the doppelganger of the word, right? So say there is a word resting on the pages of the book of the labyrinthine visions, plural, 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 plural. So there's no way that you could miss that, right? This is an image of Prometheus, an early painting I did. Now here's one that is not plural. But if you go through, yeah, well, many of them are not plural, actually. All right, so the function was to create this sort of experience in this work that that would, not merely allow a reader to sort of voyeuristically observe this mind, but to create the experience in the mind of the reader of this plurality of visions. So so I want to break off there and talk about the way that it was received a bit, and problems of interpretation and the reading of this particular work. Perhaps, not really understanding its larger social political context, or the way that, in some sense, the way that the use of this found material was intended as a kind of challenge of lyricism, but also a history of the way that ideas that relate to the idea of madness had always been a part of this tradition. There's Cocteau's Orpheus, and there are a lot of Orpheuses actually. But this idea of the poet and his muse, not just in Plato, but there had always been a kind of affinity between this possessed or inspired or poet of genius and the jinn or spirits, or whatever one might call them, of the madman. And I wanted to explore that, but without necessarily being entirely explicit about it. What was explicit about it was the way that it presented itself as being a vision, and the way that it referred to madness throughout the poem, and the way that it used I, the way that it used you, and the way that it stole, right, in the way that the messenger Hermes steals, right? So it plays also with that idea. Before I move on to reception, I should say something about that. It plays, and here's a stranger. So strangers are always in my work always references to Dionysus, and Dionysus, if you recall the figure of the child Dionysus being held by Hermes, is always has this interesting relationship to a message, right? Because he comes as the stranger from within, and masked and hidden in some sense, but to reveal. So there's a really interesting relationship between Dionysus and Hermes that's sometimes overlooked, but certainly not in that famous statue. But Hermes was the messenger of the gods, right? So he conveyed messages from this divine realm to this quotidian realm of human experience. And in that way, he was very much like these ancient archaic voices that were inspirations of the divine, but that made their way into our lives, via these mediums. So the poet was also a kind of
messenger, or at least a vehicle of the messengers that maybe were the voices in the poems themselves. And so this Hermes figure, and Hermes, the patron deity of thieves, related back to Prometheus, who stole fire from the gods. So he was also a Hermes-like figure that like traversed this betwixt and between these sacred knowledges and their expression in our human world. And I thought of all of that also as belonging to this idea of eternal return, or the repetition of the divine in our daily lives, and it required this sort of messenger. So those Hermes figures and just the Promethean stealing of fire, theft, was an extremely important part of the work. And another reason, not to label the individual voices in the poem. Black Sun should be familiar. Reference is a reference from Harry Crosby. It's a reference from Rene Dumal. I think Jerry Rothenberg used this reference a few times. There are some other more insidious uses of this particular idea elsewhere, which isn't to say that I couldn't become personal. But when I did, it was often almost a joke. All right, so that's enough on the construction, and then I'll turn, perhaps not today, but later, to takes on this work, and how it was positioned in various literary loci.